Do you know what day it is? Yes, it is my day. 30 is certainly a big milestone. And to celebrate my birthday and the big 30, I thought I would talk about 30 books that changed my life. Whether it be reading the book or the book itself is tied to a really strong memory, it's changed me or my life in some way, it's changed my worldview, it's a book that shaped my reading taste, or it's just one of my ultimate favorites and it hasn't left my brain. Before we jump in, I did want to shout out a few creators whose videos inspired this one. The first video I came across was from Katarina Reem, talking about 27 books on her 27th birthday, but I can't seem to find the video. I'm not sure if I'm just completely overlooking it or if she's maybe privated it, but I did want to shout out Katarina. Also Leora Eileen, who did one for her 26th birthday, and Chandler Ainsley also recently did one talking about the 30 books that changed her life. So those creators / videos are linked down below, but let's get started. This isn't going to be chronologically per se, but I will start with the books that I read during my childhood. Swim, Polar Bear Swim by Joan Stimson, illustrated by Meg Rutherford. So this is the first book that I have a memory of picking out for myself. It was during preschool and they had a bit of a book stall. I'm assuming to raise money for the preschool. I'm not sure if they brought new books in or they were just selling off their old books to then restock their little library. But I remember seeing this on the spinning cart and deciding that it would come home with me. It's honestly so incredibly beautiful. Hello, are you kidding me? Maybe this is what kind of kicked off my love for polar bears, perhaps. But it's about a cub called Polar Star who is learning to swim and having to find the courage and bravery to do things on its own. Disney's Classic Treasury Volume 1. I do have a few distinct memories of me reading this, but my mum says that I was reading this constantly. Was definitely a Disney kid, and it hasn't completely fallen apart yet, but it is starting to separate a little bit, the binding. It's definitely a very well-loved book. You know what? Maybe this explains why I knew The Little Mermaid story, but it was actually quite a while before I had seen The Little Mermaid because we didn't have The Little Mermaid on VHS. I did have Peter Pan, Lion King, Dalmatians, Rescuers, and Winnie the Pooh, and a whole bunch of other ones. But The Little Mermaid was one that we didn't actually own a copy of. I was familiar with the story by the time that I watched it, so it must have been because of this. The Big Book of Knowledge, Discover Your World Through Pictures and Words. So this is a non-fiction book that's kind of a bit of a mini encyclopedia with just a whole lot of information about the world on subjects ranging from butterflies to bears and from the solar system to life in southern Africa. Oh, I remember this shark page. Just looking at this font in particular, I definitely have quite a few memories of me reading this book in bed. And it took me, I have no idea how long exactly, but it did take me a while to read this because I was super determined to finish it. I had a lot more motivation towards the start, maybe because it was talking about animals and space and the earth, and then you get to things like teeth. Maybe it was the human body stuff that I got a little less interested in. Rowan of Rin by Emily Rodder. I did also read the Del Toro Quest by the same author, and I really enjoyed all of them, but Rowan of Rin in particular, I remember that inspiring me so much so that I wanted to become an author. I remember sitting at my dad's computer, opening up Microsoft Word and starting to write my story, which was a carbon copy of Rowan of Rin. I don't think I got very far. I'm definitely the type of person that starts a lot of things and doesn't necessarily finish a lot of things, but this is what sparked my love for writing really early on in life. Alanna, the First Adventure by Tamara Pierce, which follows a young girl who disguises herself as a boy in order to train as a knight. I have some really kind of core, vivid memories attached to this one. So once again in primary school, on one afternoon where our class visited the library and had some reading time, my friends and I came across Alanna, the First Adventure, and we decided to start reading it aloud together. So we would kind of go around in a circle, each reading a paragraph. I'm not sure if it was just that one library visit that we did this. I don't think we continued reading it together, but I fell in love with the story and borrowed the book, took it home with me, and proceeded to read the entire series. I also remember doing an assignment, which was like a PowerPoint presentation on Tamara Pierce as well. I think it was just we had to kind of research the life of the author and talk about them. One fact that I remember is that I think she was meant to be named Tamara Pierce, but the nurse misspelled her name on her birth certificate, so she ended up being Tamara. I also have another experience from my childhood that links Alanna the First Adventure and Rowan of Rin, kind of. I participated in this program. One of the kind of segments of this course was a local author would come in and do some like writing workshops, and then we would each write our own short stories, and that author would then read them and give us feedback. And that author was Emily Rodder. The story that I wrote was somewhat inspired by Alanna the First Adventure. I wasn't just retelling the story this time, but I did take a lot of inspiration from the magic system and the kind of animal companion element to it. Adventures of the Wishing Chair by Enid Blyton. This is about two siblings who discover a magical wishing chair that whisks them off onto wonderful and whimsical adventures. This book I distinctly remember reading when I was supposed to be sleeping. This is one of those books that I stayed up past my bedtime to read. I would open my bedroom door a crack and let a slither of light shine through, and I would read the book by that light. And I just remember absolutely loving it and just feeling really excited to dive back in and see where the wishing chair would whisk them off to next. Maddigan's Quest by Margaret Mahy. I don't remember too much about the story, but according to Goodreads, we follow Maddigan, who is a part of like this traveling circus. And I think this group is called Maddigan's Fantasia. Garland Maddigan is the daughter of the ringmaster. They're taking a journey and some mysterious children appear and join the Fantasia. But there might be some sinister people after them. There are just some really vivid moments whilst reading this book that are stuck in my mind. I think I was given this book as a gift for Christmas one year, and I took it with me on a holiday. I can't remember if it was a road trip around Australia or if it was one of our family holidays where we visited family back in Scotland and travelled around a little bit. But I definitely read a lot of this book in the car, and I had some headphones on listening to the I Am Me album from Ashlee Simpson, but specifically the song Love. That song and this book are just enmeshed in my memory. And there's a specific point in the book where something sad happens, and I just remember having that song playing. I read that particularly sad scene and I started crying, and I just like looked out the window as we were driving through whatever countryside we were driving through, and I just had a full-on main character moment. Twilight by Stephenie Meyer. Honestly, this was such an influential series, not just for myself, but an entire generation of young readers and girls. In terms of my experience with Twilight, I think this sparked a new kind of era of my reading journey. And once again, I remember reading this while traveling. We had a layover in Singapore, and in the airport there's like a butterfly garden, and I remember sitting like on the outside of it with my nose completely stuck in the book, and I had been reading it for so long that I looked up and I could not see anything. It like my eyes weren't readjusting. I ended up finishing Twilight and immediately starting it from the beginning again because I didn't have any other books with me, or at the very least I didn't have New Moon. I remember going to various bookstores trying to find an English copy of New Moon because I needed to read it. Yeah, I was definitely deep in the Twilight fandom. I started writing some fan fiction. It was the one and only time I ever dipped my toes into fan fiction. And I also remember setting up a Twilight fan forum. I absolutely fell into the Twilight saga, adored it, as did a lot of my friends, and it was definitely something that we all bonded over. And I think probably in terms of how much it compassed my life, would have been the most influential book from my teenage years. The Host by Stephenie Meyer. So not long after dipping into the Twilight series, I remember The Host came out and I was like, I am intrigued. Yes, please. This is more of like a sci-fi story where an alien species invades Earth and kind of is a parasite that takes over people's bodies and their minds are kind of eradicated. And we follow a character who has been invaded, but her consciousness is still there. So there's like two minds living in this one body. And I have another song really tied to my memory of reading The Host, and that is Fireflies by Owl City. I was listening to that on repeat as I was reading some sections of The Host. And in terms of like my reading experience with this is the first book that I felt the urge to reread time and time again. Obviously with Twilight, I read it and then immediately started from the beginning again once I'd finished because I didn't have any other books with me. And like, yes, I loved it and wanted to reread it. But previous to that, rereading wasn't really something that I ever did. I don't remember how many times I've read The Host. I wasn't like tracking my reading at this point in my life, but I probably read it like 4 or 5 times within a few years. I just devour this book time and time again. I think I'm overdue for a reread, to be honest. Like it has been a while since I've touched this, and I would like to dive back into it at some point. The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins, a classic. I'm not sure in what order I read Twilight and The Hunger Games, but I would have read them relatively close to each other. So it was like a really strong start to this new era of my life where I was reading a lot. I think it also really drew me into the dystopian genre. I'm definitely not the only one who did this. It was definitely like a trend within publishing as well. In terms of BookTube, the 4th video that I ever posted was reading The Hunger Games as part of like Banned Books Week awareness. The first ever trailer reaction that I posted was Katniss's training clip that was teased. The Hunger Games movie reaction. There we go. Good God, that video was incredibly uncomfortable for me to continue watching, so I don't know exactly, but I'm 90% sure I went to the midnight release of the Hunger Games movie, and I was obviously very excited about it. The Book Thief by Marcus Zuzak. So this is my very own special copy that my friend Red made for me. It's just so beautiful. This is definitely one of those books that has just stamped itself on my soul. I remember being just in absolute awe of the writing. First the colours, then the humans. That's usually how I see things, or at least how I try. Here is a small fact. You are going to die. That is just so ingrained in my mind, and I remember reading that for the first time and being like, I don't think I've ever read anything like this. I was just so captivated by the fact that this was narrated by Death. I loved seeing this story and the world through Death's eyes. The way that they see humans and humanity against the backdrop of World War II in particular. And then Death is just so curious and intrigued by this little girl who steals books and makes such a beautiful and meaningful connection with this Jewish man that her family hides. Many tears were shed with this book. These Broken Stars by Amy Kaufman and Megan Spooner. This is a YA sci-fi that follows 2 characters that are on a ship that crash lands onto a planet and they have to survive. I absolutely fell in love with this trilogy, and it also afforded me some really awesome opportunities. I reviewed these Broken Stars, and then a couple of months later I actually had Amy Kaufman on my channel, which was such an exciting experience. I think Amy was the first author that I kind of interviewed or made content with, which was just absolutely amazing. First of all, the opportunity to meet Amy, and she's so lovely. It was also so much fun, and I just felt so incredibly lucky to have been given this opportunity. It was just definitely like personally a pivotal moment for me. And it was because of this that I was also sent a review copy for the next book I'm going to be talking about, which is Illuminae by Amy Kaufman and Jay Kristoff. This book blew me away. Not only did it just further solidify that, you know what, actually maybe sci-fi is a genre for me, but I had the best time reading it. First of all, I just felt so incredibly lucky and thankful to have an early review copy of this book, but I was also given more opportunities to do author interviews and video content. But in terms of like the book and the story itself, I loved the mixed media form. I don't think I'd really read anything quite like that at this point. It was just such a fun and unique reading experience. And then taking in this story in the audio format as well, when it was like full cast and sound effects. And I think it definitely played a big part in kind of kicking off that period where I was listening to a lot of audiobooks. This is just such a fantastic way to consume a story. Nevernight by Jay Kristoff. There's just a bit of a domino effect going on here because, you know, after reading These Shattered Stars and meeting Amy, who introduced me to Jay, I was given an early reading copy of Nevernight to read. We're following this girl who's been training and is trying to get into this essentially school for assassins, and I absolutely adored this book. I emceed the Sydney book launch for God's Grave and Dark Dawn, which is super exciting, and being able to interview the author as part of like their book launch tour. But I also connected with and like bonded over this series with some amazing people. Pierre and I got Mr. Kindly tattoos, and we did a lot of like cosplaying of me and Ash, and I also ran like a traveling book thing for Nevernight where I read the book, I annotated it, sent it to the next person who also read it and annotated it, and then it went on to the next and the next person, and then at the end of it getting that copy where so many people had filled the book with their thoughts and experiences as they read it was just so amazing. It's definitely a highly treasured item in my collection. Strange the Dreamer by Laini Taylor. And I'm also going to squeeze in Muse of Nightmares here as well, which is the sequel and final book in this duology. This is such a beautifully written, rich and magical story. And the story begins with a boy named Laszlo Strange, who is a librarian and is just so fascinated by this mysterious city called Weep. I just have some really beautiful memories associated with Red in particular. So I also have a tattoo, which is a quote from Muse of Nightmares, which says, "There was a silence that dreamed of becoming a song." And at the same time, Red got a quote from Strange the Dreamer tattooed as well. But obviously before this, we had bonded over the fact that we both adored Strange the Dreamer. And when I received a proof copy of Muse of Nightmares, I offered to read this to Red. So a couple of times a week we would hop on FaceTime and I read Muse of Nightmares aloud to her, which was so wonderful and honestly just such a joyous way to experience a story, reading together with someone who also is super invested in this story and loves the characters and will kind of stop in the middle of reading to talk through our thoughts and theories and what the hell is going on. This series is very, very meaningful for me. The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. This is a book that I studied in university, and like throughout my entire education, primary school, high school, and uni of studying English, this is the one that stood out to me the most. It's a short story, but it packed such a punch, and it's about a woman who, after giving birth, kind of falls into a bit of a depression, and she's basically prescribed just rest and to not do anything, like physically or mentally. And so she's basically kind of holed up in this room with this peeling yellow wallpaper. It's a story that explores oppression and the dismissal of women, and was actually written in response to something that happened to Charlotte Perkins Gilman herself. After the birth of her child, she suffered from postnatal depression, and her doctor prescribed her with a very strict rest cure. And after a few months, she stopped that treatment, realizing that it was in fact making her feel worse and not better. And I also believe that a while after this was published, that doctor did change his treatment methods. But this story has just really stuck with me ever since reading it. Warbreaker by Brandon Sanderson, a story about two sisters who are princesses, gods and immortals, and a magic system about an essence known as breath and drawing upon colors. I feel like I could have selected any of Brandon Sanderson's books to be in this list, but I specifically chose Warbreaker because it was the first book I'd ever read by Brandon Sanderson, and it just really kickstarted that love for his books. Since Warbreaker, I've proceeded to read some of the Mistborn series, the Stormlight Archive. I'm currently reading Rhythm of War, but I've also read Elantris and The Arithmetist and Skyward. Many, many books, and still many more for me to read, which is an exciting prospect. Stripped by Momo Chavez. If you don't know Momo, she is one of my dearest friends, who some may remember as the BookTube girl, but this is her first novel about a girl named Annie who starts stripping in order to fast track her dreams. It's about friendship and family, feminism, it's sex positive, and honestly, first and foremost, I'm just so incredibly proud of Momo. It's such a raw and emotional book, and I think is a really important contribution to just the wider discussion about sex work, which is something that I haven't come across much in books. That's not to say that there's no books about it. I need to be putting in more of the work for actively looking for and searching for those stories, but given how the wider society views sex work and people working in the industry, and whether that's with judgment or leaning into some of the more dangerous reactions and behaviors of not seeing them as human. I think we just need to see more stories like this that shine some light behind the curtain and the stage. I just thought this was brilliant and such an important story to tell. Minor Detail by Adanya Shibley, translated by Elizabeth Hachette. This is another incredibly important story, and I'll admit it was a hard book to read. The first part of this book is set a year after the Nakba, which was the war in 1948 that led to hundreds of thousands of Palestinians being displaced and dispossessed. The second part of this book is set many years later and follows a woman who reads this article about the events that took place in part one of this book, which was the rape and murder of a Palestinian woman at the hands of Israeli soldiers. The woman in the present day who reads that article becomes really fixated on what happened in the past, and she goes on a journey to see if she can find out what really happened. Mina Kandasamy said this about minor detail. Minor detail belongs to the genre of the novel as resistance, as revolutionary text. Simultaneously depicting the dehumanization that surrounds rape and land grab, it is a text that palpitates with fear and with outrage. As we join the nameless young woman in her quest to find the truth of a long-forgotten atrocity, we realize how dangerous it is to reclaim life and history in the face of ongoing systemic erasure. I think that encapsulates this so incredibly well. This is such an important story, and it's told in such a way that feels haunting almost. The fact that the characters aren't named, and between the past and the present day, all of the parallels and the patterns and repetition was just eerie and disturbing. It's definitely a book that hits hard, and like I said, I think a really important book that I think everyone should read. The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin. Another book that I think absolutely everyone should read. This is an apocalyptic novel. It's about the beginning of the end of the world, and it's set in a world where there are fifth seasons, which are catastrophic events that can be devastating to the point of wiping out civilizations and empires and destroying the natural environment. A fifth season has begun, and one of our main characters, Essen, comes home to discover that her son has been murdered and her daughter is missing, all at the hands of her husband. This book is brilliant. It is a masterpiece. The writing is impeccable. The world building is so meticulous and well crafted. The characters are so captivating and real. I feel like this book altered my brain chemistry. I think this is probably also one of the first books I read that included a polyamorous relationship. We also have queer and trans characters. It is definitely a hard-hitting, sometimes hard to read story. Would recommend checking the trigger warnings before you pick this one up. But it's just such a fantastic story. It explores oppression and systemic violence and prejudice. There's betrayal and there's loss, but it's also about connections and family. Please read Howl's Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones. My first experience with Howl's Moving Castle was the Studio Ghibli film, and I adore it to pieces. It is my favorite Studio Ghibli film. I have a tattoo of Calcifer as well, but I could just watch that on repeat. I also absolutely adore the book as well, but I feel like it always needs to be said. The book and the movie are a bit different. The main story thread is still the same, but there are some elements of like the world building and the broader scope of things that are more fleshed out or differs in one versus the other, but also just the tone and the vibe of them feel a little bit different. But that being said, I couldn't not put this on the list. On the one hand, because I did really enjoy the book, but also the fact that this was the inspiration for my favorite Ghibli film of all time. But there are some memories and ties to Howl's Moving Castle and someone who is no longer with us. So yeah. The Martian by Andy Weir. This is about an astronaut who is stranded on Mars once the rest of his crew think he's dead and have to leave. So we're following Mark as he's trying to survive alone, isolated, with no one else there to help him. But hopefully at some point down the line, rescue might be an option. I listened to the audiobook of this, which I would absolutely recommend. Thoroughly enjoyed it, a great way to consume the story. Even though prior to this I had read and loved some sci-fi before, they weren't ones that were leaning more into like the sciencey information element of it. Like it wasn't just a backdrop of being on a different planet or being in space, but this talks through how Mark is trying to survive as a botanist and using science to keep himself alive. Not gonna lie, that was intimidating to me, but this showed me that I, in fact, can find that interesting. I've never been particularly great with science subjects school-wise. I do find it fascinating. I do find it interesting. Hello, the book of knowledge. This book showed me that if it's done well and done, I don't know, in a way that meshes with my brain, then I can really enjoy it and appreciate it. And then since reading The Martian and that kind of gateway to be like, hey, you know what? You are big-brained enough to understand it all. I've also read Project Hail Mary by the same author, which is absolutely brilliant, but also Leviathan Wakes, the Expanse series by James S.A. Corey. I've read the first 6 books in this series, and I'm currently rewatching the TV show. With each new sci-fi novel I'm picking up, I'm falling more and more in love with the genre. The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss, which follows a man named Kavoth, and this is essentially his life story. In the present day, he is an innkeeper and is approached by someone who knows who he really is and asks him to share his story and how he became to be the man that he is. I really love that framework of a story within a story, and in that present day you can see this person at a certain point of life, but you're aware that there's a very rich history full of adventure, misfortune, and many other things. And especially when they start telling their story from the very beginning and you're like, okay, but how did we get from point A to point B? I really adore the writing style as well and how poetic it feels. I filmed a review of The Name of the Wind back in the day, and the author himself watched that video, which I find absolutely wild. Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race by Rennie Edo-Lodge. Back in 2014, Rennie Edo-Lodge posted a blog post titled Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, and it explained exactly that and why they were deciding to no longer engage with people who were not open to having productive conversations about race. That blog post was seen by many people, and this book is an expansion upon that initial post. Apologies, there is a storm rolling in very quickly, so the daylight is disappearing quite rapidly. But what was I saying? It covers Black British history, which I found incredibly informative, having not really learnt or been taught much about it. It covers things like systemic racism and white privilege, and the intersectionality of race and class and feminism. It's thought-provoking and informative, and definitely an important read. The Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon. I do love a thick fantasy that is expansive with so much rich world building and politics and exploration of magic, mystery, subterfuge, and a healthy sprinkling of queer relationships. This is definitely a favorite series of mine, but once again, some fantastic opportunities that have arisen as a result of this book. This was one of the books that we read for a book club. We were so lucky in being able to secure an online interview with Samantha Shannon. So we did a live stream before or after we had our regular live show to discuss the book. And after the release of A Day of Fallen Night, Samantha Shannon came to Australia and I hosted the Sydney book launch. Once again, just so thankful. The incredible opportunities. Like, are you kidding me? Babel by R.F. Kuang. In this we follow a Chinese boy who is an orphan and is whisked off to London by a mysterious professor. He's trained for years in various different languages in preparation for Oxford University's Royal Institute of Translation, Babel. Or Babel. So many tabs, so many annotations, because I loved this book. It's dark academia, it has a really interesting magic system that's tied to linguistics, and it explores and critiques colonialism and racism and sexism. It's definitely a slower paced book, but I was completely entranced by the writing and the exploration of words and language. And I think this is the first book that I've read by R.F. Kuang, and I subsequently read Yellowface, which I really enjoyed, as well as The Poppy War, which was gut-wrenching. Vicious by V.E. Schwab. This is about two men, Victor and Eli, who in college get sucked into the idea of the possibility of extraordinary abilities. But when they start to experiment, things kind of go horribly wrong, and then fast forward 10 years, Victor is now out of jail and is hell-bent on finding Eli. Another book that truly captivated me and showed me how much I can love a morally grey character, an anti-hero. It was a page-turner and such a fun exploration of good and evil, what makes us human, and monstrous acts. It's another book that I've read a couple of times, and I just have such a fondness for this story and these characters. Fire by Kristen Kershaw. This is a companion novel to Graceling, so we are following different characters. In this, we're following Fire, who has the ability to control the minds of people around her, and I think she's been hidden away, and there's some interesting things happening in the kingdom. Plenty of politics. There might perhaps be a rebellion brewing. This is one of those books that I went into expecting to enjoy, but it just completely startled me how much I loved this book, and it really just sunk its teeth into me, and I wasn't expecting it. I had read and really enjoyed Graceling, and I think I just expected something similar, but this had me in a chokehold. So captivated by the story and the characters and the different relationships and dynamics between all of the characters. It's been so long that I don't remember many details except for one thing that happened, and I'm like, why must trauma work like this? Heartstopper by Alice Oseman. It's been a very fun journey, you and I. I remember receiving a printed out manuscript of Heartstopper as like an early review copy. I just absolutely fell in love with Nick and Charlie and their story, their friendship that blossomed into something more. It was so wholesome and sweet. And then fast forward a couple of years, I started working for Hachette, which is the publisher of Heartstopper, and I now do the marketing in Australia, which is just an absolute wild thing to think about. It's one of the most rewarding things to absolutely fall in love with a story or a series and then have the opportunity to work behind the scenes on it is pretty damn special. Definite highlight of my career. Last, but certainly not least, The Will of the Many by James Islington. And I just devoured this. It was scrumptious in like the most satisfying ways. The only way that I can think of describing this in the most briefest of terms is that we have a world that is very like Roman Empire inspired, and society and the magic system is like a pyramid scheme, if you will. And our main character Viz is an orphan who goes to this elite academy under false pretenses, but there's also another layer of false pretenses and mystery. Devoured. Like, I ate this book up. It's one of those books that I was kicking myself for not having picked up sooner because I was like, I was depriving myself of this brilliance. But then, on the other hand, we don't have the sequel yet, so I'm now in this like really torturous limbo stage where I feel like I can't move on with life until I have the next book, but I don't know when that's going to be. I'm so excited to finally finish editing the vlog where I read this because I have so many like visceral reactions when reading this book, but literally when I finished, I stopped and I was just lying in bed and Alex comes in and he's like,
existential crisis.
It was so good.
This is just like one of those books that was all-encompassing and I loved the fuck out of it. I can't stop thinking about it. It's trapped me in its embrace and I'm okay being stuck there, to be honest. 30 years and 30 of the most influential, memorable, life-changing books in one way or another. I would love to hear about some of the books that have changed your life in some way, or if you have a really fun memory about a book, I would love to hear it. Please do share down below. Thank you so much for watching and celebrating my 30th with me. That is all for now and probably all for this year. So I will see you in 2025. Bye.